Okay, it's something in 10 minutes wherever you are, which means the meeting is supposed to start right now. And we still need a minute taker. Otherwise, we cannot proceed. Do we need to name names? Okay, Yaron, can you be voluntold to be a minute taker? Well, we didn't hear what you said, so we'll assume that it was yes. Okay, thank you. With that said, I guess we can begin. So here's the note well. I'm sure you've seen this thing before, and right now you're all sitting about 1 or 2 feet away from your screens, so can't complain about the font being too small. And this is our agenda. We've got all the technical differences and scribe and note takers and note well. Then we're going to go over the status of what's changed since November. Then we'll go over then we'll have some presentations about DTN draft, ACME subdomains, ACME integration, and something that's more akin to a discussion about onion records, and followed by any other business. So would anybody like to bash the agenda? Okay, not in the room either. Okay, with that, we can go on to status. So, since we last met, which was in November, we had 4 RFCs published. That's ACME CAA, ACME TLS ALPN, ACME IP, and ACME STAR. We also had new versions of pretty much every document that we had, because of course, since we haven't met for 8 months, then and everything that wasn't revised is already expired. With that said, there are also some related drafts that got updated. That's ACME subdomains, ACME onion, and ACME DTN node ID. And in fact, they're taking quite a large part of our agenda this time. So, anything to say about that? Okay. So, if in that case, we're going to presentations, starting with the DTN. So that goes here. Yeah. So, Brian.
I'm sorry, I was muted. So part of the presentation is general background on DTN, and the other part is specific to ACME. So we can move on to the next slide, please. For those not familiar, the concept of DTN is that it functions as an overlay network on top of some transport protocols. And this is similar in concept to the operation of email with SMTP. So a little picture on the right shows how things are layered with the bundle protocol setting on top of some transport convergence layer on top of IP. And that TCP convergence layer is one option for how to move bundles around a DTN network. There are other options, but the focus for this ACME use, and the reason is, as we'll discuss on the next slide, the TCP convergence layer. So we're not going to talk about how bundles move around the network, just know that they move from hop to hop between bundle agents and ultimately, hopefully, end up at their destination. So we can go on to slide 3. The bundles themselves are datagrams, and a bundle starts with a primary block that has addressing information and some metadata about the bundle, and then has a series of canonical blocks. One of them is always the payload, the actual thing being transported, and then a lot of them are dealing with processing controls, routing controls, security services, and things like that. So again, we don't need to get into too much details other than a bundle is a self-contained unit in roughly the same way that an SMTP message, I'm going to use SMTP as a kind of a touchstone for some of these things because the concepts are similar. So SMTP individual messages hop through the network looking for their destinations, and bundles do the same. The protocols are different, the encodings are different, but the concepts are similar. So we can go to the next slide. And here we're getting into actually what we're trying to do here. So the proposed TCP convergence layer, it defines a mechanism for using PKI certificates to do node authentication. And the two ways that it's allowed to authenticate a node is either through a node ID, which is at the DTN layer, or a DNS name, which is at the convergence layer. So we already know how to do DNS name validation in RFC 6125. And also, we already know how to do validation in the sense of a certificate issuer validating that I own a DNS name. So that's all worked out and taken care of. But the question came up is, how do I as a CA validate someone's claim to a DTN name, a node ID? And so a little bit of research was done, and ACME pre-existing infrastructure already has a well-established way to do all of the bookkeeping the CA needs to do its general purpose job of making sure that claims in a certificate are valid and that the owners are known. And so what we're trying to do here is to use that well-defined infrastructure for ACME to be able to validate another type of claim. And this is preferred over using some ad hoc mechanisms that are manual or require some nuance about how do you verify security, all the things that ACME already does properly. So next slide, please. So the concept here, going back to that analogy to email, the concept is very similar, and I even lifted some of the nomenclature from the SMIME ACME validation mechanism. So the idea here is that the bundle protocol has two different top-level types of bundles. One of them is a service payload, and one of them is an administrative record. So what we're doing here is putting this data into administrative records, meaning it's not normal service data. So the idea is that one bundle goes out from the ACME server, which is a challenge bundle, with part of the token that's necessary for validation. The ACME server itself provides the second part of the token. And then ultimately, when a node receives the challenge bundle and communicates with the ACME client about the challenge existing, then it will do the normal processing, again, the same concept as the email draft, to generate a key authorization, and it sends a response bundle back to the ACME server. So that's the core of the situation. And there's also some information in the draft that talks about using bundle integrity to sign the individual bundles. This isn't strictly necessary in the sense of making sure that a claim can be validated, but it is useful to be able to make sure that bundles pass through. Maybe if we're talking about this is because we're talking about ACME, it really is targeting an internet type open network. So we don't want to have implicitly trusted bundles. We want to use bundle security to make sure that the bundles are able to traverse ultimately to the destination and then back to the ACME server. So next slide, please. So all that being said, this draft is marked as experimental because not that DTN itself is experimental, but the use of ACME to cover this use case is new territory. And also, although URI claims in certificates and certificate requests are not new, the use of ACME to validate a URI is new behavior. And the proposal here is not that we would expect all ACME servers to be able to do DTN node ID validation, but to say when you need to do validation of a node ID for security purposes, here's the right way to do it. So I leave this open then to questions to the working group about the proposal.
Hi, Brian. I had a quick question. I don't know if I understood what you were kind of saying exactly. So is the thinking that you would have the DTN overlay and then the ACME servers that the DTN nodes are trying to reach are on the public internet versus an ACME server that's somewhere in the DTN fabric, but that's more of a closed network?
So the original concept was that if you're on a relatively controlled closed network, that you wouldn't need to use an ACME type mechanism to issue and distribute certificates. That on a tightly controlled network, probably the certificate authority is integrated with the node configurations, and there's some backchannel method of distributing certificates. The rationale for using ACME in this case is for those situations where the certificate authority doesn't have that back channel of validating things. So the use case here is for situations where there's a certificate authority that is issuing certificates to, you can think of them as gateway nodes that operate over the internet. So multiple sites have gateway nodes, and these sites don't have necessarily trust channels to each other. So the intent here is to be able to have I'll say a public CA. It doesn't necessarily mean a public in the sense of the anybody can use it, but just that it's doing validation over a untrusted channel. If that makes sense.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
Anybody else?
Hi, Rick Taylor. So I'm actually one of the DTN chairs. My question really to Brian is, what is your intention with the presentation to ACME? Are you offering to put forward this draft in ACME as a experimental or informational document doing the generic URI claim, or we'll just keep this document within DTN? I'm not quite sure where we're going.
So it's certainly intended to be kept within DTN. The use of the URI claim is new. It just hasn't been exercised before in any ACME validation mechanism. So this is a kind of a first come, first serve sort of thing.
Understood. Okay.
But the goal is to codify an explicit and well-defined method to do the job, not that it would be taken up by every ACME server.
Okay, yeah, understood, because I know we have IESG discusses on the TCP convergence layer that need to be resolved, and ACME is a good way to resolve that. I suppose my statement to the chairs is, if you want to talk to the DTN chairs about whether we keep this work in DTN or whether you want to generalize it and adopt it, I'm absolutely open to having that conversation. And we can take that offline.
Yes, Roman.
Yeah, back again. So given that clarification about clearing the ISG discusses, I'm trying to understand the architecture a little bit more. So the ACME servers on the public internet, not necessarily for public use, they would have understanding of the DTN addressing magic that they would have to validate in the URI? Or is this for certificates for the external interface for those gateway DTN nodes?
So an ACME server that would implement this draft would need to be a DTN node participating in a DTN network and have all of the things in the same way as an ACME server implementing the SMIME draft needs to be a trusted SMTP server, with other SMTP servers using it as an SMIME. I'm not familiar with the exact terminology, but it needs to be integrated with the other SMIME servers that it's trying to validate domains on.
Right. No, I understand now. The key thing was when you said kind of gateway, I was assuming that it was some you're kind of talking about something more multi-home, but the ACME servers you're talking about are part of the DTN network in question.
Yes. Yeah.
Got it.
But the intended use case is for those kind of inter-site, inter-domain DTN nodes where the node is forwarding and accepting bundles to other sites or to other domains, and so there isn't that implicit level of trust.
Okay, this is Yoav speaking as an individual. So the ACME servers are CAs, and the CAs that work for the web, the public web, have usually been very reluctant to provide services for things that are not the public web. It's hard to even get SMTP certificates, let alone user certificates, and pretty much nothing for any other use. So I'm not sure you can expect those CAs to provide certificates or an ACME server that will work with this new use case. Maybe they will.
I agree with that, and that's understood in this, and that's why this last item is that what's being proposed here is the mechanism for when you want to do a thing, here's how to do it, and not an expectation that there will be uptake on those web-focused ACME servers.
Yeah, we have the TN auth list stuff, which is unlikely to be hopefully not part of the WebPKI. It is going forward for mobile phones. So we definitely have precedent within the working group, and we expanded the charter to have a bunch of different challenges. My inclination would be that if unless DTN strongly wants to own this, we'd collaborate. But I think it makes sense for if the working group would choose ACME to be the home for this.
So Rick Taylor again with my DTN chair hat on. DTN, if I'm honest, is quite a small focused working group. So we're not sure we have the bandwidth to handle this without constantly asking the ACME working group for advice. So if you want to work on this in ACME, we would be very happy.
And from my perspective, it's also quite convenient that the scope and the mechanisms of this validation method are so similar to the SMIME one, that they really have all the same bookkeeping and the same really security implications.
So, Rich, do we want to try the hum tool for this? And I can't hear you at all.
Should we ask how much familiarity the working group has with this document? Have folks read it, looked at it?
I think we know the answer to that, but I'm willing to ask that question as well. Okay, let's try this. So I'm going to start the hum, and hum as loud as you can if you have read or are familiar in some other way with what this document is proposing. I'm starting the hum now. And unfortunately, I haven't prepared any canned music. You really don't want me to sing, so I'll spare you that. Two, one, and we're done. So we're pianissimo, which means not very many hummed or not very loudly. So with that, I'm kind of reluctant to ask about adoption. And so I guess please read it, and then we'll take it to the list. Yes, Alexi has something interesting to say. So, yes, Alexi.
Yeah, I'm just maybe ask who is willing to read and review the document, even if people haven't read it.
Okay, and what I do know is to never do that on the hum. So please type a +1 in the chat room if you're willing to read it within the next, I don't know, month or two, so that we can then do. And I see 1, 2, 3. I can add my own. That's cheating, Rich. Okay, so we've got about 5 people who state they're willing to read it. Better than nothing. Okay, so please read it, and we'll ask on the list in a month or so whether you think it's worthwhile, and then maybe we'll do a call for adoption.
All right, thanks for your time.
Anytime, okay. So with that, the next thing is Owen with ACME subdomains. Please come up to the mic. Virtually, of course. And tell me when you want me to flip a slide.
Can you hear my audio?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is an update on ACME subdomains. We can flick on to the next slide straight away. It's just a summary of what ACME subdomains is about. The baseline ACME RFC allows an ACME server to issue certs for a given identifier for a subdomain without requiring a challenge to be explicitly fulfilled against that identifier. So in principle, an ACME server could issue a cert for a sub.domain.com where the ACME client has only fulfilled the challenge for the parent domain. And an ACME server could issue certs for a large number of subdomain certs and only require a single challenge to be fulfilled against the parent domain. So this is nothing new here. This hasn't changed since IETF106. So next slide. Okay, so again, this is just a summary of the call flow. What it illustrates on the left-hand side is an ACME client doing a pre-authorization for a parent's domain that I've simply illustrated as domain.com. It sends in a new authorization request to domain.com, gets back the list of authorization challenges, fulfills the DNS text challenge, and then posts a challenge response and verifies that. That's verified by the ACME server. Then after this pre-authorization has taken place, then it illustrates the client on the right-hand side in step 2, placing an order for a subdomain of that parent domain. The illustration here is just doing getting a cert for one subdomain, but there's no reason why a client couldn't continue and request certificates for multiple different subdomains off that parent domain while only completing one pre-authorization for the parent domain. Next slide. So what's changed since 106 and draft 01? There was some mic comments at IETF 106, and there's some chatter on the mailer since then as well. And those 3 comments have been addressed. First is what this draft 02 defines as a base domain Boolean field in the authorization object to explicitly differentiate between an authorization for a parent domain versus an authorization for a wildcard. Second, there was a bit of confusion because the example I just went through discussed pre-authorizations. There's a bit of confusion in the text that this is limited and restricted to just pre-authorization, but that is not the case. So I've tried to clarify the text. This works for the pre-authorization and explicit authorization in band as well. And finally, there was a bit of confusion as well in the mailers as to whether this was just applicable to CA browser forum or baseline requirements, and it's not. This is generally applicable to ACME and similar to the ACME base RFC. The draft doesn't really state anything explicitly about CA policy. So it could be applicable to CAs that conform to CA browser forum baseline requirements, but it doesn't necessarily have to be used by those servers. It could be used by different CAs that have their own policies, or it could in fact be used by private CAs or IoT CAs. I think, next slide, that's it. So next slide, what's missing is security considerations. This has been missing for a while. I must chase Tim Hollaback on this, but he had agreed to write this at one of the last IETFs. That's the only update. The update was just to address the comments from last time round. So is there any interest in going next steps here? Is there an interest in an adoption call or any other open questions or any other? Well, first, has anyone read draft 2 that have tried to address the three major comments at IETF 106? So any questions?
Just a minute to point, as the agenda points out, we had intended to issue the call for adoption the last time we met face to face. My mistake in letting that fall through the cracks. So there are 2 questions, I guess. How many people, who has read the draft, who is interested in progressing it, working on it? And then we should, this time for real, do the call for adoption and confirm on the list.
So we got a couple of people willing to review in the chat room. And that's the classical meaning of couple, 2. Three. I guess since we're anyway going to do a call for adoption, we might as well do it, and hopefully more than 3 people will answer, yeah, we like the idea, and willing to work on it. So, bottom line, we'll take it to the list. And with no further comments on this one, I guess we'll move to the next one, which is also Owen.
Okay, so quick update on ACME integration, so we can go straight to the next slide straight away. So what this does is just describes what this informational draft does, is just describe how ACME, baseline ACME, can be integrated with multiple different existing client or device search enrollment mechanisms without requiring any changes to the baseline ACME specification whatsoever. It just outlines some informational use cases where ACME is really, really useful. So next slide. So these are the 4 main use cases that we've outlined that are captured in the draft. There's a slight update to this on the next slide. But the 4 main use cases are ACME integration with EST, ACME integration with Brusky, which is bootstrapping remote key infrastructures, ASCII integration, or ACME integration with Brusky Cloud Registrar, which is Brusky Cloud Registrar is it's a subset of Brusky that what the Cloud Registrar defines is how the default mode of Brusky operation when a customer network does not have a registrar deployed in the local network, a device can fall back to a cloud registrar. And what Brusky Cloud Registrar does is fill out some details that are missing from the baseline Brusky draft. And finally, TEAP, tunnel TEAP, tunneled extensible authentication protocol. What I have here as well, I've referenced both TEAP RFC 7170 and a draft that Elliot Lear and I are working on, an EMU draft Lear TEAP Brusky, and what draft, well actually if you go on to the next slide, it explains this in a little bit more detail. So what's changed since IETF106 is the TEAP and TEAP Brusky sections of ACME integrations have been collapsed into one section. Because what baseline TEAP, if you read baseline TEAP in detail, it's missing some very important search enrollment capabilities that Elliot and I have worked to introduce in draft Layer TEAP Brusky. So we're actually refactoring the TEAP update draft a little bit to focus less on the Brusky part and more on the search and enrollment parts. And 2 key things that draft Layer TEAP Brusky defines is CSR attributes TLV, which allows a TEAP server to give instructions to a client on what attributes it expects that client to include in a certificate enrollment request, similar to EST. And the second thing that the update does is it specifies a retry interval. So if the server is willing to issue a cert but isn't able to issue the cert straight away, then the server can instruct the client to retry after a suitable timeout, which is very similar to EST enrollment as well. So these 2 attributes are missing from baseline TEAP, and they're pretty much essential for doing an integration with ACME. So that's one of the reasons why I've slightly refactored this informational draft to collapse the TEAP and the TEAP update or the TEAP Brusky sections into one section. And it probably does not make sense to attempt to integrate ACME with baseline TEAP at all. because I think we need the CSR attributes TLV and the retry TLV for ACME integrations to be successful. Like, for example, if the ACME server replies with some kind of timeout saying, your certificate enrollment is pending, there's no way for a TEEP server to turn around and tell a client that your certificate enrollment is pending. So that's the major change to the draft since 106. We just simplified a little bit and collapsed 2 sections together. So next slide, please. The security sections, security consideration is still to do, but this will be, as this is informational and we're not making any changes to any of the drafts we're referencing at all. We don't expect this to be controversial at all, and we're certainly making no changes at all to the reference security consideration sections in EST, Brewski, or TEEP. The 2 other drafts we reference, the EAP update draft, the draft Layer EAP Brewski, and the Brewski Cloud draft as well. Either the security sections for those are either not complete or they have not been formally reviewed yet. So I think in our minds, we'd like to wait until the security considerations in those 2 drafts have been finalized and reviewed before we just write and complete the security consideration sections on this information draft. But even saying that, we don't expect anything controversial here. We're not changing the behavior of any of the reference protocols. We're just stitching them together. So we expect the security consideration sections just to be a short summary of the sections from the other drafts. Next slide, please. So we've had limited reviewers on this yet, but again, it is just information and stitching existing specifications together and not changing them at all. So we would like is, if anyone on the list is willing to review this, or anyone on the list is willing to provide feedback on this draft, and then Michael and Rifat and I will gladly incorporate that feedback. That is it.
Oh, and I assume through participation or your author participation, and have you actually, you participated with the other groups, but have you also reached out to them and got feedback besides just the set of authors?
Yeah, we have presented this at EMU as well, and we presented this at EMU. We didn't present it at EMU this time around, but we presented at EMU in 106, and we got some feedback. Well, actually, when we presented at EMU is one of the reasons why Mike Richardson is now a co-author, because he was very interested in participating based on seeing it at EMU, and we've had some feedback from Elliot Lear and some feedback from Dan Harkins out of EMU as well on this. And we've incorporated, so that feedback was probably in private or back channel conversations. It wasn't on the mailers, but we've incorporated feedback from EMU in the draft already.
Okay, that's good. So it sounds like don't think it's ready for adoption yet, but it occurs to me that if we do adopt this informational, I think it'd be the first published informational document, and that we would make a point of reaching out to the other working groups and asking them to review it too.
Well, I think this one is an IETF draft. This was adopted actually last time around, but we just had a limited number of concrete reviewers to it. It was just Subdomains one that wasn't adopted, but this one actually was. And we did have a discussion at 106 whether this would live in EMU or whether this would live in ACME, and we came to the conclusion that it would live in ACME. Or maybe that was at 105. But either at 105 or 106, we discussed between EMU and ACME, and it landed in ACME.
Yes, thanks for the reminder.
Yeah.
Okay. So could any folks who have read this, could you please do a +1 in the chat? We'll do the same thing with this as we did with the previous one. Not seeing much yet.
it's informational. There's nothing controversial or new here, and there is working code behind this. I know Mike Richardson has this working already, which is one of the reasons why he was eager to jump on and co-author it.
All right, so we do have some interest, and you have mentioned that the other groups have been looking at this. Maybe we do time to review, call for adoption, a week before we do your other draft, since we want to keep them separate, and this one might be further along and simpler to progress.
And if you can encourage people who don't normally come to ACME meetings to read it anyway and send something to the list, that would also be great. So if there's nothing more, I think we can move on to onion routing and Roland. Thank you, Owen.
Thank you.
Yeah, Roland, go ahead.
Cool. So this draft was mainly instigated by the fact that the CA browser forum has recently changed the validation rules for onion addresses. So previously, onion addresses were only allowed in EV certificates, which meant that there was very little interest to have any kind of validation mechanism in ACME, since otherwise EV certificates are basically impossible to do via ACME currently. So now that they can be included in domain validated certificates, it seems like there is some interest, speaking as a representative of a public CA, to issue DV certificates containing onion addresses. So this is basically, the draft currently includes a validation mechanism that basically is a mirror of the existing CAB forum validation mechanism. And a quick explanation of that mechanism is basically that the v3 onion addresses are essentially just encoded ED 255.19 public keys. So the mechanism is quite simple. You create a CSR that contains a nonce provided by the CA, a nonce provided by the client, and you sign that CSR using the private key, and then the CA simply verifies the CSR using the public key and the address. And the document has left out. You can also do validation simply using the existing change to a website validation mechanism, which is in 855.5 is HTTP 01. I haven't specified usage of that mechanism simply because, again, speaking as a representative of public CA, we don't really have any interest in running a Tor stack in or anywhere near our CA. I think some CAs may be interested in doing that, but we want to steer clear of that. So if you want to move on to the next slide. I think that there are two kind of big open questions with the document as it is written. The current validation mechanism is rather complicated. The use of a CSR this is an artifact from the previous version of onion addresses, which were essentially using RSA 1024 keys and truncated SHA-1 hashes. So the validation mechanism was kind of over-constructed to try and get around some slightly dodgy security properties and using those keys. And as was discussed on the list previously, it turns out that actually the attempt at performing hash strengthening actually doesn't work, because the way the two server and client provided nonces end up being ordered, the server nonce always ends up being the prefix. So there is still some weakness there if we were still using RSA 1024 keys. I think it would be nice to try and define a slightly more simple mechanism that doesn't have these kind of workarounds for security issues that no longer exist with ED 225.19 keys, but it's not strictly necessary in order to get a validation mechanism that is CAB forum approved. And then the other question is, right, do we want to specify usage with HTTP 01? I think if we did that, it would probably warrant some discussion of a security consideration section of how closely you want your validation stack to be to a Tor stack. But right, this is probably more of a policy question for a CA than it is something we can strictly specify. So if anyone has any questions, I would be interested in hearing them. I think there's been a bit of discussion on the list, but right, I think that the only interest from CAs that I've heard is from Let's Secret. So interest from others would be appreciated.
Rich, I think you said something, but we didn't hear anything. Still not. I'm still not hearing anything. It's strange because I do see the microphone icon next to your name, but not getting any audio.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the mic in front of Rich's name anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe drop it on Jabber while we sort it out.
so while we're doing that, okay, I'll just repeat what has been said in Jabber, that Rich got it wrong, and the integrations draft is already a working document, so there's no need to do a call for adoption. We'll just read it, and then we'll decide if it's ready for working group last call. So what he's saying now is, we're just asking the working group for input if anyone wants to say anything. That's about the onion routing. And the silence is deafening. Okay, the interesting part is that this is really all we had planned for this meeting. So, anyone have anything to say about onion addresses? and ACME. Going once, going twice.
I guess just to kind of give an example of what this likely would be used for, I think in the current CA ecosystem, the most common use case is that you would create a certificate containing both a DNS name and an onion name. So one very popular example of this is that for the Facebook hidden service, they have a certificate that contains both facebook.com and the hidden service address. And there's been some discussion within the Tor browser community about trying to use this as a way to essentially bind these two names together so that you could be connected to the hidden service, but the URL bar might actually show the DNS name rather than the hidden service address. And Rich, the name sounds familiar, but I don't think I've talked to him specifically about this. I think that it would be a good idea to reach out.
The name question is Alec Muffet, which is suggesting that we reach out to, and he'll send an email. Okay. And if that's all we have, then this slide, is there any other business? Okay, then I guess we all got almost 50 minutes of our lives back. Okay, thank you all for coming, and hopefully next time we can meet closer together. Well, not next time, but the time after that. Okay, thank you all. Yeah, stay safe and healthy. And thanks to everyone for taking notes. And thanks to Mike for waiting with that until the end of the meeting.